The Amazon does not announce itself. It simply thickens. The air first, then the light, then the ground itself, until distance stops meaning anything you can measure. Heat presses against skin like a hand that never lifts. Insects find every seam in clothing within the first hour. Rivers braid and vanish and reappear under different names. This is not a place that resists a man. It simply continues, indifferent whether he continues with it. Men have crossed it for centuries. Few leave the same men who entered. What does it take for a man to walk past the edge of every known map, twice, 3 times, 7 times, and still believe the 8th attempt will be different? What happens to caution after decades of survival? And when a father brings his own son past that edge, whose certainty is he really following? For 100 years, this case has survived mostly as rumor. A lost explorer, a golden city, a jungle that swallows men whole. But underneath the legend is a documented record, and that record is thinner than most people realize. Subscribe, because what remains of this story deserves to be carried forward accurately, before the last details blur into myth entirely. 3 men entered the trees that day. 2 guides turned back before them. One number never changed in 100 years of searching: 0. 0 confirmed, 0 recovered, 0 answers. April 20th, 1925, Cuiabá, Mato Grosso, Brazil, the last outpost before the map ran out of names. Cuiabá sat at the edge of 2 Brazils, the one with roads, telegraph lines, and newspapers, and the one that began somewhere past the last fence post and did not end for 1,000 miles. In 1925, it was still a frontier town, dust in the dry months, mud in the wet ones, the kind of place where an expedition bought its final supplies before disappearing into silence. Beyond it lay the Cerrado, dry scrub forests, thorned and merciless underfoot. And beyond that, jungle no outsider had mapped. The dry season had only just turned. Rivers were still passable. It was, by every account available, as good a window as the region ever offered. Percy Fawcett was 57 years old, a former artillery officer who had spent nearly 2 decades charting rivers no cartographer had touched. He had already made 7 expeditions into this same basin, each one carving away at the blank spaces on the map, each one feeding the same conviction. 5 years earlier, in a library in Rio de Janeiro, he had found a document, manuscript 512, describing ruins of an ancient stone city somewhere in this region. He called the city Zid. He had chased it twice already and been driven back both times, once by the fever that had nearly killed him, once by a horse that dropped dead beneath him at a campsite he would return to and rename. He was checking the lashings on the packed mules for the 3rd time that morning when Jack, his son, asked whether he'd remembered to pack the idol. He had. A small stone figure, given to him years before by the novelist Rider Haggard, who claimed it carried some old and unverifiable power. Fawcett didn't put much stock in curses. He put stock in maps, in bearings, in the stubborn arithmetic of putting one foot in front of another for months at a time. But he packed the idol anyway, wrapped it himself, and said nothing more about it. Jack was 21, broad-shouldered, quieter than his father, and had spent most of his adult life training for exactly this trip, running, fasting, hardening himself on his father's orders, certain this expedition would be the one that mattered. Beside him stood Raleigh Rymel, Jack's closest friend since childhood, along for reasons that had less to do with lost cities than with loyalty to Jack. Two local guides rounded out the party, hired to carry supplies as far as the edge of country they knew. Fawcett had turned down other volunteers for this trip, men with more jungle experience, more military credentials, men like T. Lawrence, who had asked to come. He wanted Jack. He believed after 7 failed expeditions that this one would end differently, and he wanted his son beside him when it did. They set out from Cuiabá that morning with pack animals, provisions rationed for months, and a route only Fawcett fully understood. He had written ahead to his wife Nina, promising to send word whenever the trail allowed it. He kept that promise for a while. The letters came steadily at first, then less often, then from places with names only he recognized. Somewhere ahead of them, past the Sehadu, past the rivers with 3 different names, was the last stretch of country he had ever turned back from. And this time, he had no intention of turning back again. May 29th, 1925. Dead Horse Camp, Mato Grosso, Brazil. Fawcett had named the place himself 5 years earlier on the expedition that failed. His horse had gone down here, exhausted past recovery, and he had shot it rather than watch it suffer through another mile. The bones were still visible in the grass when the party arrived, bleached, half sunk into the ground, the only marker for 100 miles in any direction. It was, Fawcett noted, without apparent irony, exactly where he had turned back the last time. Getting here had already cost them weeks. The party had cut through miles of Sehadu, dry, thorned scrub that tore at clothing and skin in equal measure. Before the country opened into gorges, they had to climb hand over hand, packs passed up ahead of them man by man. They had forded streams too deep to wade and swum them instead, boots tied around their necks, rifles held above the current. Hunger had been a constant companion rather than a crisis. Rationed meals stretched thinner each week, the fish and game grew scarcer. By the time Dead Horse Camp came into view, all 3 men had lost weight they could not afford to lose. The camp smelled of wet ash and boiled rice, the 2 guides' fire still smoking from the night before. The air had the particular density of the wet season closing in, thick enough to feel on the back of the throat, threaded with the sour green smell of crushed undergrowth wherever the mules had grazed. Somewhere close, unseen, insects kept up a constant metallic drone that never fully stopped, day or night, until it became less a sound than a kind of silence of its own. Fawcett sat with a pencil and a small notebook, the paper already soft with humidity, and wrote what would become his final letter to his wife. His handwriting, usually precise, ran slightly uneven, not from fear, by every account, but from the awkward angle of writing balanced on a supply crate, pencil lead smudging against a page that would not fully dry. He gave the letter to the 2 Brazilian guides, along with clear instructions. They were to go no further. From this point, the 3 Englishmen would continue alone. It was not an unusual decision. Fawcett had made similar cuts on previous expeditions, believing a smaller party moved faster and drew less attention from anyone who might not welcome strangers. The guides did not argue. They had grown more nervous the deeper the party pushed, and Dead Horse Camp was, by Fawcett's own reckoning, already past the edge of country any of them had reason to know. The last written words attributed to Fawcett described the crossing ahead, a promise that contact with local indigenous groups was expected within a week or two, and a line meant to reassure Nina that there was no cause for fear. Then the guides turned back toward Cuiabá, carrying the last confirmed proof that the three men were alive. What remained with Fawcett, Jack, and Rymel has to be reconstructed from what they were known to be carrying and what search parties later failed to find. They had rations calculated for a limited stretch of travel, expecting to supplement them with fish and game as they moved, a plan that had worked imperfectly on previous trips. They had trade goods intended for any indigenous groups they encountered: beads, cloth, small tools, offered in place of the guns they deliberately avoided using as leverage. They had basic medical supplies, inadequate against the fevers that had already nearly killed Fawcett once. They had no radio, no way to send word forward, and after this point, no way to receive it either. They had the idol Jack had asked about in Cuiabá, still wrapped, still carried, whatever weight anyone chose to give it. What they did not have, from this point forward, was any witness who spoke their language. No guide fluent in the region ahead, no fallback if illness, injury, or hostility made the crossing impossible. No compass bearing sent home more recent than the one in Fawcett's own head. Every account of what followed depends entirely on people the three men had not yet met, and on how much any of them were later willing or able to say. 3 men, then. A handful of pack animals to carry what little weight remained. Weeks of rationed food, a bag of trade goods, a theodolite for taking bearings that would, years later, turn up in someone else's hands. And whatever the idol wrapped in Fawcett's kit was actually worth. Nothing measurable, and yet packed anyway. Carried the same distance as the rifles and the rice. If you had to choose between speed and safety, with everything you owned already on your back, fewer people to feed, but no one left who could go back for help, which would you have chosen at Dead Horse Camp? Fawcett had made that calculation 7 times before, and been right often enough to trust it again. Whether he was right an 8th time is a question the record never answers. Tell us in the comments which choice you think you'd have made, standing where he stood. The Upper Xingu Basin does not behave like a single place. It is a system of systems, Say-Ha-Do giving way to gallery forest along the rivers, gallery forest thickening into rainforest proper as the ground gets wetter, each zone with its own rules for what can live in it and how. Rainfall here can exceed 2,000 millimeters a year, nearly all of it compressed into a 6-month wet season that turns dry stream beds into arteries capable of stranding a man on the wrong side overnight. The soil, for all the density of what grows in it, is thin and nutrient poor. Most of the forest's mass is not in the ground, but in the living canopy above it. The region doesn't want to kill anyone. It has no want at all. It simply operates on rules that assume nothing arrives from outside it, and it does not adjust those rules for whoever does. The Xingu River system that the party was approaching was, in 1925, home to multiple indigenous groups, among them the Kalapalo, who had lived within this specific ecology for generations, reading it in ways no outsider's notebook could replicate. They knew which fish ran in which season, which plants treated fever, and which caused it, where the river could be crossed and where it could not. Fawcett had studied indigenous survival methods across 7 previous expeditions and respected them more than most Europeans of his era did. He traveled without heavy firearms, in part because he believed guns provoked exactly the kind of confrontation a smaller, quieter party could avoid. It was a calculated strategy, not naivety, and it had worked for him more than once. The temperature itself was rarely the danger. Daytime highs in the low 30s Celsius. Not extreme by tropical standards, but the humidity turned exertion into something closer to drowning in slow motion. Every climb, every crossing, every mile of Sehadu cut through with a machete cost more water than the body could easily replace, and dehydration crept in long before thirst gave any clear warning. Fever was the other constant threat, not from one source, but a whole ecosystem of them. Waterborne parasites, insect-borne infections, wounds that refused to close cleanly in wet air. Fawcett had survived fevers on previous expeditions that had killed other men outright. That survival was part of what convinced him he could survive this one, too. Within the gallery forest, animal life adapted to conditions the 3 men were only beginning to learn, each species solving the same problem of scarcity and threat in its own way. Capybara stayed close to water they could vanish into at the first sign of a predator. Jaguar moved by scent and shadow, rarely by open confrontation, ambush being cheaper than any chase through undergrowth this dense. Insects operated on a schedule no watch could predict, different species biting at dawn, at dusk, in the wet heat of midday. And the men's applied remedies, citrus juice, smoke, whatever oils they carried, worked only partially and only briefly. Even the birdsong followed rules the men had to learn to read. Certain calls falling silent meant something moving nearby that the forest itself had noticed before any of them had. The party's first real lesson in the system came at a river crossing narrower than the Kulu-Eni, but no less dangerous. A current strong enough that one of the pack animals was swept downstream before it could be recovered, taking a portion of their remaining rations with it. It was the kind of loss that would have ended a lesser expedition. Fawcett adjusted the following day's rationing without comment, according to what limited record survived in his last letters, treating it as data rather than disaster. One more variable folded into calculations he had been running for 19 years. What they could not adjust for was time itself. Every mile deeper meant a mile further from any possibility of resupply, from any guide who could carry word back to Cuiabá, from any version of rescue that didn't require someone else choosing to come looking. The theodolite readings Fawcett took each evening, precise bearings logged into a notebook increasingly soft with humidity, were the only thread connecting where they stood to any map at all. And that thread grew thinner with every crossing. Jack and Rymel, younger and less experienced, learned the system's smaller lessons the hard way, which vines held weight and which only looked like they would, which standing water was safe near and which drew insects thick enough to drive a man to a fever within a day. Fawcett corrected them without much patience, according to the accounts of men who had traveled with him on earlier trips, but he corrected them, which was its own kind of investment. He needed them capable, not just present. What none of the 3 could have known, moving through gallery forests that looked identical mile after mile, was how closely the system ahead was already being watched, by eyes that had tracked the party's smoke and noise for days before any of the three men noticed they were no longer alone in it. This is not a story where the jungle is the villain. The Xingu Basin has sustained human life for thousands of years before Fawcett arrived and for a century after he vanished into it. What makes this record worth preserving isn't a battle between man and nature. It's the documented, verifiable account of exactly how far one calculated risk can be pushed before the calculation runs out of information to work with. That's the thread this file follows next. Into the days the record can no longer fully confirm. The Kalapalo village lay a short distance beyond the Cuiabá River, and by the time the three Englishmen reached it, the trip had already taken a physical toll the record is specific about. Raleigh Ramel was limping badly, his leg marked by sores from Bora Shudo flies that had turned infected somewhere along the crossing, the kind of wound that, left untreated in this climate, only worsens with every additional mile walked on it. Jack was thinner than the man who had left Cuiabá, worn down by weeks of rationed food and unbroken exertion. The training his father had put him through for years now being spent down to nothing he could bank for later. Fawcett himself, by every account, showed the condition least, 57 years old and somehow still the most durable of the three, a fact that would have meant something to men who had spent 2 decades watching him outlast younger companions on every previous trip. This was not the first indigenous settlement the party had passed through since leaving Cuiabá, and by this point in the journey, Fawcett had a working method for these encounters. Trade goods offered without pressure, no weapons drawn or displayed, patience allowed to do the work that force couldn't. It had held up on 6 previous expeditions. There was no reason yet, from where the 3 men stood, to expect it wouldn't hold up on the 7th. The Kalapalo received them without hostility. They were fed fish and biju, a flatbread made from manioc, the first meal in some time that hadn't been carefully rationed. Ramel's leg was looked at. Whatever relief a full stomach and a night off the trail could offer, all 3 men had it, however briefly. It should have been, on paper, a moment of relief. What the Kalapalo said next made it something else. They told Fawcett not to continue east. The territory beyond the river, they said, belonged to people the Kalapalo themselves considered dangerous, tribes with whom contact meant violence, not negotiation. It was not a vague caution. Later testimony describes it as a direct and specific warning, delivered by people who knew the country the 3 Englishmen did not. He didn't know it yet, but that warning was the last piece of information anyone outside his own party would ever have about what lay ahead of him. Fawcett listened, and Fawcett refused to change course. It is worth sitting with why, because the record allows for an answer here that doesn't require guessing at his state of mind. He had turned back twice before, once from fever, once from the horse that gave the camp its name, and both retreats had cost him years of fundraising and campaigning just to try again. He was 57. There would not be a 4th attempt. Whatever calculation he ran, weighing a warning from strangers against 2 decades of accumulated certainty, it ended the same way his calculations usually ended: forward. The Kalapalo did what they could within the limits of their own judgment. They didn't try to physically stop 3 armed foreigners from making a decision. that wasn't theirs to make. Instead, 3 of their men ferried the party across the Cuiabá River by canoe, the river itself too wide and fast to cross any other way. Its current strong enough that a mistimed crossing could have ended the expedition on the spot, before any tribe further east ever entered the story at all. The Englishmen thanked their hosts, gathered what remained of their diminished supplies, and stepped onto the far bank. It is the last bank any outside witness ever saw them stand on. What Fawcett couldn't see from where he stood on that riverbank was how closely that departure would be studied decades later by researchers with no stake in the legend at all, only in what the Kalapalo themselves had preserved and repeated, unprompted and unchanged for 100 years. For the psychological cost of this stretch, the record offers less certainty than it does for the physical one. No diary survives from after Dead Horse Camp. No letters describing what passed between father, son, and friend in the days before the crossing.
Understood, sir.
What can be said with confidence is bounded by what these 3 men were known to be, not by invention. Fawcett had spent his adult life training himself against exactly this kind of doubt. Colleagues and biographers alike describe a man who treated hesitation as a flaw to be drilled out of himself, the same way he drilled Jack for this trip for years in advance. He talked, on previous expeditions, of pushing past what he called the give-up point, the moment a lesser man would turn back, as though it were a fixed marker on the trail rather than a different place in every man's body. Riemel, in pain and increasingly slowed by infection, had every physical reason to want to stop and no standing to insist on it. He was there because of Jack, not because of Z, a passenger in someone else's obsession, now paying for it in his own leg. Jack occupied the hardest position of the 3, old enough to have doubts of his own, young enough that voicing them against his father's 20 years of conviction would have taken a kind of courage the record simply never had the chance to witness. What the answer came from was not persuasion. Whatever conversation happened at that riverbank, if it happened at all in words rather than in silence and habit, ended the only way this family's dynamic had ever been documented to end, with Fawcett's judgment standing unchallenged, and the other 2 men falling in behind it, the way they had fallen in behind it in Cuiabá, and in London, and in every year of training that had led to this river. The small stone idol, still carried, still wrapped, made the river crossing along with everything else, tucked into a pack now lighter than it had been in Cuiabá in every way that mattered, except this one. Whether anyone touched it, unwrapped it, or thought about it at all in that moment isn't something any surviving account can answer. But it crossed the Cuiabá the same as the rifles, the notebook, and the theodolite, carried by the same hands into the same silence. What the Kalapalo did next is the last verified fact of this stretch of the story, and it is the fact this file has been built around from the beginning. Every evening for 5 consecutive nights, they watched smoke rise from a campfire to the east, a fire lit each night by hands unseen, the only remaining proof that 3 men were still moving, still alive, still making the same choice to continue that Fawcett had made at the riverbank. On the 6th night, watched for as carefully as the 5 before it, there was no fire at all. Before the smoke stopped, there was a letter. the last one anyone would ever receive from any of the three men, carried back across the Kulu-e-Ne by the departing guides, and eventually delivered weeks later to a house in England. It was, by every description of those who read it at the time, an oddly ordinary piece of writing. Fawcett gave Nina a rough timeline for what to expect. Silence for a while, as they pushed into territory with no way to send word, and no cause for alarm if that silence stretched longer than usual. He mentioned the mules. He mentioned the weather. He described the crossing ahead in the same clipped, practical language he'd used in 6 previous letters from 6 previous expeditions, each of which had eventually been followed by his return. He closed with the kind of plain, domestic reassurance husbands write when they expect to be home to make good on it, hopeful, unremarkable, entirely unaware that it would be read and reread for the next 100 years as the last proof he had ever existed at all. Nina kept that letter for the rest of her life. It was, in the end, the only complete sentence her husband ever finished that she could still hold in her own hands. What happened after the smoke stopped is the one place in this file where the historical record cannot offer a single confirmed answer. Only several competing possibilities, each with its own supporting evidence, and none of them ever proven beyond doubt. The Kalapalo themselves believed the 3 men were killed by a tribe further east, people they described as fierce, and with whom they had no relationship of trade or safe passage. It was the explanation closest to the last confirmed information available, a specific warning given, specifically ignored, followed by silence in exactly the direction the warning had pointed toward. It required no embellishment, and unlike nearly every version that followed it, it came from people who had no reason to invent a story for an audience thousands of miles away. A second possibility carries equal weight among researchers who have studied the case without any interest in a dramatic ending. Jack was exhausted. Ramel was already fighting an infection that had not improved by the time they crossed the river, the kind of wound that in this climate can turn septic within days rather than weeks. Fawcett was 57, and however durable he had proven himself across 2 decades, still a man asking his body to keep producing effort it had less and less of to give. Illness, starvation, or simple physical collapse in unmapped terrain with no possibility of aid required no hostile encounter at all. Only the same conditions that had nearly ended Fawcett's second expedition, this time with no fallback route to retreat along and no guides left to carry anyone out. A third category exists only because the first 2 weren't dramatic enough for some of the people who went looking afterward. In 1928, an expedition leader claimed to have identified the specific chief responsible for Fawcett's death, a claim that collapsed under scrutiny almost as quickly as it was made, built largely on secondhand rumor, gathered without a translator who could actually speak with the Kalapalo directly. In 1932, a Swiss trapper claimed to have found Fawcett alive hundreds of miles from where the trail had gone cold, bearded, held captive, and wearing animal skins, a detail contradicted by nearly everyone who understood the climate well enough to know no one wears fur in equatorial heat. Nina, desperate enough to believe almost anything, said she recognized a ring the trapper described. The sighting was never corroborated by anyone else. In the 1950s, a set of bones was produced and presented as Fawcett's remains, accompanied by a second-hand account of a Kalapalo confession to the killing. Nina refused to accept them, and later examination found no reliable connection between the bones and the man they were said to belong to. None of these later claims changed the only fact that has held up for a century of investigation, expeditions, and speculation from 3 continents. After the 6th night without a campfire, no one who was not already part of the expedition ever again had confirmed contact with Percy Fawcett, Jack Fawcett, or Raleigh Rimmel. Not a letter, not a verified sighting, not a body. The record simply stops at the tree line east of the Cuiabá River, and everything past that point belongs to speculation, not history. By 1927, the date the expedition had estimated for its own return, no word had come. Newspapers that had spent years describing Fawcett as nearly indestructible began, cautiously at first, to describe him instead in the past tense. Rumors filled the space the facts refused to occupy. That he had gone native and was living somewhere in the forest by choice, that he had been made chief of a tribe, that he was being held for reasons no one could quite explain. Each rumor got a headline. None of them got an answer. In London, a woman who had spent 2 decades organizing her entire life around her husband's expeditions was left with nothing to organize around at all. No confirmation, no funeral, no single fact she could hold that told her, one way or another, what had become of the 2 people she loved most. Nina Fawcett would spend the rest of her life refusing to declare her husband dead, corresponding for years with anyone who claimed new information, certain, against mounting silence, that somewhere beyond the Cuiabá, Percy and Jack were still alive and still trying to find their way home. She died without ever learning otherwise. That absence of an answer, more than any single theory about what happened in the forest, is the actual weight this part of the story carries. Some silences end. This one, as far as the historical record is concerned, never has. 1928. Mato Grosso, Brazil. 3 years of silence and the first real attempt to end it. The Royal Geographical Society sent Commander George Dyott into the Xingu that year, following, as closely as anyone could reconstruct it, the same route Fawcett's party had taken from Dead Horse Camp. Dyott's expedition was larger than Fawcett's had ever been. Better supplied, better armed, everything Fawcett had deliberately traveled without, on the theory that a smaller party moved faster and threatened no one. Dyott reached the Kalapalo, gathered second-hand accounts, and emerged from the jungle convinced the 3 men were dead, killed at the hands of a specific chief he believed he had identified. It was a definite answer to a question that had been sitting open for 3 years. And for a while, it was treated as close to final. It did not hold up. Dyott had worked without a translator fluent enough to speak with the Kalapalo directly, relying instead on second-hand accounts filtered through multiple languages before they reached him in English. The identification of a specific killer fell apart almost as soon as other researchers examined it. What Dyott had actually found was not proof. It was the same fact the Kalapalo had been offering for 3 years already, dressed up as a discovery. More searchers followed across more than a decade. Some came looking for evidence, some came looking for a story, and the 2 were not always easy to tell apart once a headline was attached to either. In 1932, a Swiss trapper's claim of an elderly white captive, bearded and held against his will somewhere along the Rio Orinos, sent a fresh wave of hope through England, hope Nina Fawcett held on to even after the account fell apart under examination. She said she recognized the description of a signet ring the man reportedly wore, but no one else ever corroborated the sighting, and the physical details didn't survive closer scrutiny either, including the detail of animal skins, an impossibility in a climate that would have made fur unbearable. In June 1933, something did surface that could be verified. A theodolite, the same kind of instrument Fawcett had used every evening to log his bearings, recovered near an indigenous camp in Mato Grosso. It was authenticated as his. It had almost certainly been left behind or traded away before the party's final push east, a fragment of the expedition that made it out of the jungle when the men who carried it never did. In the 1950s, a set of bones surfaced, along with a second-hand account of a confession, a claim that a group had killed the three men and could produce the remains as proof. Nina refused to accept it. Later examination found no reliable connection between the bones and the man they were said to belong to, one more lead absorbed into the same pattern as the ones before it. Confident at first, unraveling on closer look. No trace of the small stone idol Jack had asked about in Cuiabá was ever recovered, then or since. It remains, by the only account this file can offer, exactly where the last confirmed sighting left it. Wrapped, carried, crossing a river with three men who did not come back. By some estimates, figures that circulate widely but were never compiled through any single rigorous count, as many as 100 people died over the following decades in expeditions mounted to solve the mystery Fawcett left behind. Whatever the true number, the pattern is documented well enough on its own. Search parties disappearing, one after another, into the same territory that had swallowed the original three. In 1996, a well-funded expedition led by a British businessman was captured by indigenous people near the search area and held until a substantial ransom in equipment and cash secured their release. Proof a full 70 years later that the country east of the Kulu-Eni remained exactly as unwelcoming to outsiders as the Kalapalo had warned Fawcett it would be. What the searched decades actually returned in the end was not Fawcett, not Jack, not Raleigh Ramel, and not the city he had spent half his life chasing. It returned a theodolite, a handful of contested rumors, most of them dismantled by the same scrutiny that had built them up, a body count of its own, stacked on top of the original three, all of it circling a silence that no expedition, however well-funded, however determined, ever managed to close. The cost fell heaviest on the people who never entered the jungle at all. Nina Fawcett spent the better part of 30 years corresponding with psychics, trappers, missionaries, and strangers who claimed to have news, refusing every offer of a funeral, refusing every version of closure that wasn't her husband and her son walking back through the door. She kept the last letter. She kept the timeline he had given her before the silence began. She died still waiting for a piece of information that never arrived. Not a rescue, not a body, not even a confirmed grave to visit. In a story that this channel has learned to measure in physical scars and documented injuries, Hers was the cost no photograph could capture. 3 decades spent holding a question open that history itself had already, quietly, stopped answering. No grave exists for Percy Fawcett, Jack Fawcett, or Raleigh Rymel, and none was ever likely to. No official date of death was ever confirmed by any government or institution with the standing to declare one. The case remains, a century later, exactly what it became on the 6th night without a campfire. Open. Nina Fawcett died without her answer, still corresponding about possible sightings decades after most of the world had stopped looking. So did every searcher who followed her into the same silence and came back with nothing but rumors, or didn't come back at all. Brian Fawcett, Percy's surviving son, spent years defending his father's memory against the sensational claims that kept surfacing. Bones that weren't his father's, sightings that collapsed under any real scrutiny, without ever gaining the one thing that would have ended the argument for good. What the historical record can state with confidence ends at a riverbank in 1925, and everything past it belongs to probability, not proof. But the search for what Fawcett was actually looking for did not end there, and this is the part of the record most people never hear. In the 1990s, working alongside the Cuiabá people in the exact region east of the Cuiabá, where Fawcett's trail went cold, an anthropologist named Michael Heckenberger began uncovering something the maps of 1925 had no way to show. Not one lost city, but a network of them. Plazas, roads wide enough for modern vehicles, defensive earthworks, farmland engineered across thousands of square kilometers, home at its height to tens of thousands of people, centuries before any Europeans set foot in the basin. Archaeologists now call the largest of these settlements Cuiabá. It sits almost exactly where Fawcett believed his city of Z was waiting, in country the outside world had spent 100 years dismissing as empty wilderness. He never found it. He was 7 decades too early, without the tools, the training, or the time to see what was buried under the same forest floor he walked across looking for gold and stone monuments instead. The city was real. The myth he carried in his head about its shape wasn't quite right. Both of those things turned out to be true at once, which is closer to how history usually resolves its mysteries than anyone standing at Dead Horse Camp in 1925 could have guessed. The case resurfaced fully in the public imagination in 2009 when a journalist retraced Fawcett's route for a book that carried this file back into wide circulation, later adapted for the screen. 100 years on from the last confirmed campfire, the core questions haven't changed at all. Only the record has grown a little more complete, one recovered fragment at a time. A theodolite, a set of ruins, a letter a widow refused to stop rereading. 3 men crossed a river once into country that had already warned them what waited on the other side. For 5 nights, smoke over the trees was the only proof that the choice they'd made was still, for the moment, survivable. On the 6th, there was nothing to see at all. The Amazon never answered for what happened next, and it never has. It simply continued, the way it always had, the way it still does today over Cuiabá's buried plazas and dead horse camps, bleached, long-vanished bones alike, indifferent to whether anyone was still there to walk it, and entirely unconcerned with whether the record ever closes.